It was one of the most startling covers ever published by Time magazine. On April 8, 1966, they dared to ask a question that a lot of people in ivory towers had already been asking. Is God dead? In the modern age, was there any proof that God exists? Or was he just a fairy tale dreamed up to make us feel better about the brutality of human existence? Today, on It Is Written, we're going to look at one of the most fundamental questions ever asked. Does God really exist? It has stood the test of time. God's book, the Bible. Still relevant in today's complex world. It is written. Sharing hope around the globe. Presented by Shawn Boonstra and Mark Finley. Does God really exist? Number 1 in the Big 5 Questions About Life.
A little while ago, I was flying across the country, and I discovered to my delight that my seatmate was a great travel companion. We shared a lot of common interests, so we were able to pass the time quite well. But then the subject of religion came up. "What do you do for a living?" she asked me. "Well," I said, "I'm a minister." "Wow," she said, "that's really interesting. I'm an atheist." "Really?" I asked. Because, to be honest, I don't actually believe in atheists. Not if you define atheist as someone who knows for sure there is no God. As she started to explain her lack of faith, she said, "Listen, when I was a kid, some pretty awful things happened to me. And when I went to the minister looking for answers, he didn't have any. So even though today I find religion very interesting, I personally don't have much faith that God exists." So as it turns out, my new friend wasn't really certain that God doesn't exist. She was just disappointed with her experience. Today, Pastor Mark Finley and I are going to wrestle with one of the biggest philosophical questions of all time. Does God really exist? Mark, as always, I'm delighted that we can spend some time together today.
I'm delighted again, Shawn, to be able to have this dialogue about the existence of God.
Yeah, it's really one of the questions that has captivated philosophers and thinkers for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And you know, Mark, you've been in ministry now for going on 40 years. You've traveled the world, and I'm sure you've run into a lot of people who wrestle with that question, does God really exist? And you know, Mark, I'm thinking in particular of a time when you addressed a group in Eastern Europe some time ago that claimed to be atheistic. They actually challenged you to prove that God exists, didn't they?
Well, Shawn, that was a fascinating experience. I was in Eastern Europe when the Berlin Wall fell. I began to work in Eastern Europe back in the late 80s, 87, 88, 89, under communism. And when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, I was preaching in Hungary and in the capital city of Budapest.
That must have been a remarkable experience.
It was remarkable. You know, thousands of people marched in the streets, and you saw during those years, right after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, this hunger for God. The universities opened up, and I was invited to come to numerous universities to speak to the students on the subject of God and the existence of God. And one of the things that happened was quite fascinating. The president of one of the universities in Hungary came to me, and he said, "Now, Dr. Finley, would you be willing to come and lecture at our university? And the subject is astronomy."
Astronomy. They didn't ask you about theology, but astronomy.
Well, he said, "I want you to show from astronomy that God exists."
Wow.
And, you know, I'm not an astronomer, but I did have a lecture, a slide lecture with my graphics and the computer on astronomy. So I agreed, and he said, "Now, but there's one caveat. We have an astronomer in the astronomy department at the university. You will speak on why God exists, then he will speak on why God doesn't exist." And I thought a minute about that, and I knew that I was being set up. And I said, "You know, I'm willing to do that on one condition. Since I am your guest, let your astronomer speak first. Let me speak second," you see. So he agreed. I got to the university that morning, and he met me at the door, and he said, "Now, there is a problem." And I thought he was going to cancel the lecture. I had no idea what the problem was. And he said, "Here's what the problem is." He said the astronomer had another appointment. He couldn't make it.
So he wasn't coming.
He wasn't coming. So I said, No problem. Give me 2 hours with the students, 1 hour to lecture and then another hour to answer questions. So I lectured during the first hour, and we talked about the heavens and the vastness of space and the evidence that God exists from design, the fact that where there is design, there must be a designer. Where there's creation, there must be a creator. And so we went over that evidence. At the end, I noted there was a section for the faculty. And one of the students kind of looked over at the faculty, and I knew he was prompted by some PhD faculty person that wanted to kind of tie me up.
So they were trying to set you up. This had all been arranged ahead of time.
For sure. And so one of the students stood up and he said, "Our famous, renowned Soviet astronaut, Yuri Gagarin, traveled into space. He didn't see God. Have you ever seen God?"
Wow.
And you know, there are times in your life where the God that you believe in gives you an idea. And I knew it, so I knew what they were doing. So I said, you know, before I answer that question, I do have a question that I want to ask the faculty. And then I'll go to students' questions. And I said, faculty, let's leave God out of the question. Let's leave the Bible out. I'm a believer. You folk are not believers. But let's leave all that out. I just want to ask you one philosophical question. Of all the knowledge in the world, how much do your students have? Do they know 50% of all there is to know? Do they know 80% of all there is to know? You know, how much do they know?
These were some pretty bright students.
Extremely brilliant. And so I said, look, let me give you an example. Let's take the 16th Ming Dynasty of China. Can you give me, in order, the 17 emperors in the 16th Ming Dynasty?
Now, Pastor Mark, I can't name one of them. Not one of them.
I'd be hard-pressed as well, sure. Then I said, now, what about the caliphs of Saudi Arabia in the 7th century A.D.? Can you list for me, please, the first 15 caliphs in order, list who their wives were, who their children were? Of the 1,500 known languages in the world, how many do you speak? Do you speak 1,300 of those? If you had a test by the leading astrophysicist in the world, how much would you know? Can you recite for me now the chemical compounds in order, and then describe for me, and you know, they saw where I was going, and I said, of all the knowledge in the world, say of all the books in the world, just printed this year, how many have you read?
Amazing.
Let's say that you know 50% of all there is to know. From an intellectual standpoint, professors, you're grading these students. Do they know 50% of all there is to know? They said no. Do they know 30% of all there is to know? No. Do they know 20% of all there is to know? No. I'm going to give your students the benefit of the doubt and say this is such a prestigious university that your students know 5% of all there is to know. That means you don't know 95% of all there is to know.
That's a lot you don't know.
Now, if you, by your own admission, only know 5% of all there is to know, and if by your own admission you don't know 95% of all there is to know, is it possible intellectually that God exists in the 95% of the knowledge you don't have? Intellectually, is that possible?
Sure.
And I saw these atheistic professors, Shawn. It was amazing. They were shaking their heads. They knew intellectually in their minds that that was a reasonable argument, that if I only have 5% of the base of knowledge and I don't have 95%, it is possible. Then I said to them, if you acknowledge that, you are not an atheist. Because an atheist says, I know for absolutely sure God doesn't exist. Now, what you're saying is that he may exist, but he may exist in the knowledge I don't have. Then I said, now I have another question for you. Let's suppose that in life there are only two alternatives. First, there is no God. You are here by evolutionary chance. There is no purpose for your life, basically, and you are an advanced animal, and you die. You go into the grave. There's nothing after. Worms eat your body, your bleached bones. That's it. That's one choice. You struggle through life. You claw your way through life. You battle through life. Some good things happen to you. Some bad things happen to you, but that's it. On the other hand, in life, there is another alternative. There's a creator God that made you, that fashioned you, that shaped you. He loves you. He cares for you in life. And this creator God that fashioned you, that shapes you, that loves you, has a plan for you. And you can exist with him through all eternity if you only had those two choices. that after death there is a marvelous plan, that not only is he here with you here, but he will live with you today and be with you. But through all eternity, he has joy and happiness and abundant life, and your mind can expand, and you can live life in the most productive way, and you can fulfill the reason for your existence. If you only had those two choices, what would you choose? If you only have two choices, and they said, Doctor would choose the latter. I said, if you would choose the latter, every reasonable person would. You're not an agnostic, you're a seeker, and that's why I came.
Amazing. Now, how did they react?
They reacted positively. We talked about how the great philosophers down through the ages acknowledged the need for God. Carl Jung, for example, who was not a Christian initially, or a believer, philosopher, psychologist, said, man does better if he acts as though God is there. Another psychologist said, if God did not exist, we would create him, because deep within the human heart, there's that sense that there must be more in life, that there must be more. You know, and if you look at scientific law, Shawn, you look at biology, one of the fundamental laws of biology is that life begets life.
Right. So, yet, as I understand it, I mean, as Darwinism made its impact on society in the 19th century, as people started to find reasons to dismiss the existence of God, they came up with a scientific absurdity.
Sure.
They said life must have come out of mineral.
Right.
Life must have come out of a primordial broth.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible? It's just not possible.
See, and the evolutionist said, given enough time, it is possible. See, that's their big argument, time. But if you look at biology number one, fundamental biology, biology 101, it says, life begets life, that non-living things do not produce living things. But evolution says, given enough time, non-living things will produce living things. I remember I was checking into a hotel here in the United States, and the person behind the desk and I got a little acquainted, and I had stayed at that hotel for about 3 weeks. I was on actually an itinerary holding a series of Bible lectures. It was down in Orlando, Florida. So I got to know this young man, and one day I walked in, he said, "You're a preacher, aren't you?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "You've been staying at this hotel for a couple weeks?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "I just want you to know," and he was a little, not defiant, but almost in your face, and he said, "I'm an atheist." And I looked up at him and said, "You know, I'd be an atheist too, but I just don't have enough faith. You have more faith than I do. So since I have to go by logic and I don't have enough faith, I can't be an atheist," and I walked away. He called to me, Shawn, across the hotel lobby. He said, "Hey, preacher, come back here. What are you talking about?" I said, "Well, you know, I admire people that have faith like you, and I admire people who can make that quantum leap." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Did you take biology? It says life begets life, and you believe that non-living things produce living things." I said, secondly, the second law of biology, at least when I took biology at university, it said like produces like. Life produces life, like produces like. And I said, what you're saying is non-living things produce living things, and things that are not alike, things that are alike don't produce things that are not alike, and you will call that an aberration, a mutation, but it's not basic science. And we talked about that. We talked about how mutations normally are destructive.
Yes.
And this young man said, you know, I need to look at this again.
You know, really scientifically, Mark, there has never been a time when somebody mutated in recorded history and developed some new part of their body that was advantageous. It just has never happened. But here's another question that has to do with the existence of God. If a society dismisses the existence of God, as many modern societies have, at least in the 20th century, what happens to morality? What happens to right and wrong if God doesn't exist?
You know, Shawn, I've had a chance to observe that firsthand. From about 1987 through till today, I've been traveling to the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The interesting thing I observed is this. Under communism, the average Russian woman had 6 abortions by the time she was 40. Six.
That's unbelievable.
Alcoholism is off the charts. Suicide is dramatically high. Now, here's the issue. I remember right after the fall of communism, I was invited to come out to a city of Pushna, and that city is not far from Moscow. It's about 50 miles from Moscow. It was a city of biological scientists. 30,000 biological scientists lived there. It was a closed city to any foreign observers. After the fall of communism, that city opened up, and I went and spoke one night, lectured to 1,000 biological scientists in that city. They chose the topics. The first was, does God exist? The second one, is the Bible true? And the third is, who is Jesus? Now, at the end of the 3 nights, the way the format was of the programs were I would speak for 45 minutes, and they would write out questions and answer them. I wasn't concerned about the lectures, but I was really concerned about the questions, because I knew I was facing some of the top brains of the world.
Right, and you can plan a lecture, but you can't plan a question.
And I thought, this is going to be tough. After the fall of communism, when I was there, Shawn, in 3 nights, I didn't get one question on science. Not one. Not one question on atheism. I got questions like this. How do you pray? If God is so good, why is the world so bad? How can you have a better marriage? How do you forgive people that hurt you? So at the end of 3 nights, I knew this audience by now. I had been speaking to them, answering their questions, meeting with little groups of scientists. So at the end of the 3rd night, I said to them, you folk have really surprised me. I'm standing in the midst of some of the brightest minds in the world, and you don't ask me one question about science. You don't ask me one question about atheism. Why not? And one of the scientists said something, Shawn, that I've never forgotten all my life. He said, this is why. We, for the last 40-some-odd years, have tried atheism, and it has failed us.
Amazing.
We have tried atheism, and we have seen that it leaves you morally barren. It leaves you with no hope, no future. So the question to us is not whether atheism is the answer to the question of life. The question to us is whether Christianity is. So you don't have to answer all the questions about atheism. We just want to know that Christianity is the best viable option.
So after living atheism all that time, after living a godless existence, there was still, after all those years, a hunger in their heart for something more. They recognized there was something lacking.
Augustine put it well. He said that there is a God-shaped vacuum in every heart. He said, Lord, our hearts will never find rest until they find rest in you. And I believe that's true of every atheist. You know, there may be somebody watching this program today that you listen to the arguments and you say, you know, I can go either way on these arguments. Christianity takes a leap of faith. The existence of God takes a leap of faith, and atheism takes a leap of faith. And I would acknowledge that you're correct, that there is no amount of evidence that can prove to your mind that God exists. Neither is there any amount of evidence that can prove to your mind that God does not exist. So basically, whether you choose the atheistic philosophy or you choose God, there is a leap of faith. Now, what I would say to you is I think the evidence is certainly on the side of God. Pascal, years ago, the great French philosopher, made this observation. And Shawn, here's what Pascal said. He said, it's called Pascal's wager.
Right.
You may have studied it back in psychology.
That. You bet.
Pascal said this. He said, if God does not exist, if God doesn't exist, and you don't believe in him, you've not lost anything. If God does exist, and you don't believe in him, you've lost everything. So he said, why not wager that he does? Because you haven't lost anything. See, and that's the leap of faith that I invite you to take today. That to accept the living God into your life through a leap of faith is worth it.
Mark, I believe that. You know, a little earlier in today's program, I mentioned a lady I was sitting with on the airplane, and as we began to discuss her atheism, she told the whole story. She said, I was hurt as a child, and something horrible happened to her. She told me what it was. And when she went to the minister to ask why, he didn't have a good answer. And that was the reason she chose not to believe in God, not because she'd weighed all of the arguments in the balance. Let me ask you, we've looked at now why people struggle. What is the greatest evidence you have seen of the existence of God?
Shawn, all over the world, the greatest evidence that I've seen of the existence of God has changed lives. And let me tell you a story that, to me, is remarkable. Young man, head of a motorcycle gang, in and out of prison scores of times, scar down his face, born up in the state of Massachusetts, where I was from Connecticut, New England. His name was Bucky. This guy came to my meetings with his motorcycle gang. I preached. He came forward, accepted Christ, you know, and many in his gang accepted Christ. A totally changed man. He used to go out on Saturday nights, get half drunk, take a beer bottle, break it on a wall, and go stick somebody in the face for joy.
Unbelievable.
One night, Shawn, after a meeting, I was talking to Bucky. He was about 6'2", bearded, scar on his face, leather jacket, leather boots, you know, and we were kind of joking back and forth because by now he had accepted Christ. After one of my lectures, a middle-aged man came up, a businessman. He had a suit and tie on, and the guy began to argue with me about the existence of God. And this little businessman who thought he was so smart, so intelligent, and he was very bright, actually shook his finger in my face. And I was tired. It was the end of a lecture. And I looked over at my friend Bucky, 6'3", this huge guy, and I said, "Bucky, I'm a little tired tonight. Take care of this guy." And the guy couldn't figure it out. You know, he kind of shaky. He said, what do you mean? And I said, "This is my buddy Bucky, and he's here for guys just like you." And the guy kind of shook, and Bucky looked down at him, and this is what he said, Shawn. He said, "Sir," he said, "if this were 6 months ago, I would have taken you out in a back alley if you insulted a good friend of mine like that. But," he said, "you better be glad that there is a God, because he changed my life. So now I just want to hug you." And he reached out and hugged the guy.
Amazing.
The guy was amazed, you know.
Amazing.
The greatest evidence that God exists is Bucky's, whose hearts and lives are changed by the grace of God.
You know, I can say the same thing even on a personal note. I wasn't always a preacher. I was raised in a Christian home, but there comes a time when you ask questions. But my own heart's been changed. It's all the evidence that I needed. It's when and I've had the privilege as well as you of working with thousands of people who, when I see them come from witchcraft or from atheism or from a hard life or murder or prison, suddenly believing in God. It's amazing what God can do. You know, I've often heard it argued that it's impossible to prove or disprove the existence of God. And I suppose if you want to do it with a pocket calculator, there might be some truth to that statement. But in the final analysis, just because you can't quantify it, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. For example, I could tell you that I really love my wife, but how would you measure that scientifically? You might try pointing to evidence, like the amount of time I spend with her or the way I speak to her. But that's not really quantitative scientific evidence, because you can't put love in a test tube and measure it. And maybe the existence of God is a little like that. When we look for absolute proof, the kind that would completely satisfy the scientific method, maybe we're trying to empirically quantify something that just doesn't work that way. Maybe when we do that, we're trying to measure the infinite in terms of ounces, grams, or gallons, and frankly, the Almighty just doesn't fit into a test tube. But that doesn't mean we don't have evidence. The Apostle Paul reminds us in Romans chapter 1 that we have plenty of it. In Romans 1:20 he writes, "For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." According to the Bible, there's enough evidence that nobody really has an excuse for not noticing the existence of God. And if you really want to come face to face with him, take a quiet moment and examine your own heart, because there is a divine spark there that confirms, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that we are more than just carbon-based life forms. In the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3 and verse 11, it says, "He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity in their hearts." God has planted eternity in your heart. There is something inside your heart that tells you to reach beyond yourself. I have no question that somebody listening today has experienced disappointment. You've suffered the kind of crushing blows that make you doubt. And maybe you've been let down by people who call themselves Christian. But stop to think about it. Why is it you still have such an ache in your heart to know that God exists? Why is it that your disappointment is so, well, disappointing? It's because you were born with eternity in your heart. There's a part of you that longs to reach out for God's hand and find out that He's really there. I think that today would be the perfect time to take that chance. You know, Pastor Mark, as we've been talking today, I know that somebody watching this program today is struggling with the existence of God. And in their hearts, they'd love to believe that He really exists. They've had disappointment, they've had letdowns, they've had pain in their lives, but they still want to believe in God. And I think it'd be nice to pray for them.
I'd love to, Shawn. Father in heaven, somebody is struggling today. Somebody today has gone through pain and sorrow and disappointment in their life. They've gone through agony, and through their tears, they're crying out to you. They wonder whether you exist. And Father, I pray that you'd reveal yourself to that person now. May they sense your love, your care, your goodness. May they have that spark of hope in their heart. May they know that you're there by their side to lift them from the drabness and the dreariness and the lack of fulfillment in their life. Father, we know it takes a leap of faith, and it takes a risk to trust our lives with you. I pray for that person right now that they would take that leap of faith. They'd reach out and grasp your hand and sense your strong arm around them and sense that still small voice that gives them hope just now. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Have you ever wondered, if God is so good, why is the world so bad? Is Jesus really coming soon? What are the signs of the end? Or how can I find real peace of mind? What really happens when you die? Do you have too many questions and too few answers? Join the tens of thousands around the world who are finding answers for themselves in the Discover Bible Guides. The Discover Bible Guides unlock and answer age-old questions directly from the Bible. These easy-to-do Bible study guides can be yours absolutely free. There is no cost or obligation. We will send you these full-color guides immediately, and you can complete them in the comfort of your own home. Or if you have a computer, you can do them directly on the internet at our website. Here's the information you need.
You may request today's offer, the Discover Bible Guides, by calling our toll-free number, 1-800-253-3000. Call right now. The operator needs only your name, address, and phone number, plus the name of today's offer, the Discover Bible Guides. Lines are open 24 hours daily. They may be busy, so keep trying. You may also request today's offer by writing to It Is Written, Box O, Thousand Oaks, California, 91359. Our free offer is for an address in North America only. The Discover Bible Guides are also available on the Internet. Just visit our website, itiswritten.com. Also online is a complete script of today's program. If you wish to help the worldwide outreach of It Is Written, your tax-deductible gift may be sent to the same address. Or you can make a gift online at itiswritten.com. Thank you for your letters and continued support. Our toll-free number is 1-800-253-3000, and our web address, itiswritten.com.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this week. If you'd like to keep studying, why not visit our webpage, itiswritten.com. And until next week, remember, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God.